Good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, Volume 2. We are on page 1172. 1172. You can find the pages on ayinbeis.com where all these pages are scanned to follow along with the text. Okay. So we're in the middle of a question, actually two questions, to explaining the context of the kav as it relates to existence, cheseni sakav, the outer dimension of the kav, of that line, that ray of energy that creates existence. The previous sakav, which is like the Ayin of the Yesh Amiti, that reflects the source. To explain that, went into Baruch Kvoid Hashem Mim Kaimai, to explain what means Mim Kaimai. Malchus is Kvoid Hashem, and it's being Baruch, it's being blessed, being drawn down from its source, Mim Kaimai. What is this source? The source of Malchus of Ein-Sof, basically, which we said was the Cheseni Sakav is rooted there. So that's what we're in the middle of explaining. To explain that, we're in the middle of Hayu Shmoi Belvad. Actually, Nivra Elam, there was him, who? God, Shmoi Belvad, and his name. So who? Good, you say that God existed, but Shmoi is only relevant when there's another, a Zulas. Since actually Nivra Elam, there is no Zulas, as we explained. So what's the role of the Shmoi? What is its meaning? What is its level? What is its significance? So to understand that, he went further into the subject matter of the process of how God actually creates existence. And briefly, what we learned yesterday was our thoughts, his thoughts, his thoughts are not like our thought, like your thoughts, which means that when we think, we don't create. Our thoughts do not create reality. As we discussed at length yesterday. God's thought creates. And Adarabah, on the contrary, the Rabbi Rashab said, the primary creation is in thought. What is thought? That he brought two sources. Eitz Chaim, when it arose in his desire, which here he's equating Ratzon and Machshava, and Dezer, Kat Solig Beru'usa Lemivra Alma, when it arose in his desire to create the worlds. So that created already. That's like Breishis Nami Maimerhu. The creation, however, on that level is still like a seed, meaning everything is in a concentrated nakuda, point. It's all concentrated as one. You don't have the details. The details come out like dibur from machshava. So machshava, the Kadosh Baruch Hu creates. God's thought does create. What other statements did he bring? Yeah, his scotch was bria. And then Yitzira is galasa yesh. It reveals, like I mentioned, like a raw piece of clay, and then begins to emerge from it the details of what's all included in that one creation. Yeah. Machshav and Dibur is Bri Yitzira. Like it is with thought and speech, that even though the words and the letters originate in thought, but they become tangible and concrete when they're expressed in speech. That's what he says. The Dibur Galza Asis. They become, yeah. So we say Baruch Sha'amar V'Haya Elam, even though he uses the word Amar, he says Amira Belev. It's speaking to yourself, and essentially, which is essentially speaking in your heart. And that creates, and that's Bereishis Name Maimerhu. It encompasses all the other 9 statements. And then they come out in Dibur in detail, in speech. So the last thing we learned, which I'm going to start from there. The line begins on page 1172. Lies bebchinis mitzias. So he says, we learned this yesterday, but I'll go over it again. Where does this machshava reside, so to speak, in the geography of Seder Shtalshlus? So obviously, just as we learned with Ayin, that it's all over, machshava can be a level in Bria compared to Yitzira, Bria, and Asiya. It could be an Atzilus, it could be. But Bechlolus, in general, it's machshava agdumadak. Bechlolus ha'elemis, When you talk about the general structure of the whole, of all the domains, of the dimensions of existence, the elam is the worlds, machshava zu, this machshava, we're discussing machshava agduma dak. Machshava agduma. Gduma means primordial, the original thought in Adam Kadman, in the original Adam. Adam Kadman is basically, we've talked at length and we discussed that Adam Kadman is the first all-encompassing structure of Ishtalshalus. So it's not an Adam like in Atzilus, where you have Erdis and Kalim and the functional, but the general image of a structured existence is Ak, Adam Kadman. So there we call Machshava Gduma Da'ak. Shezeh Inyan Kad Solik B'Ru'us L'Mivra Alam. That's what it says in Zohar that we quoted earlier, cited earlier, that when it arises in his will to create the worlds, where's this will? That's Machshava Gduma Da'ak. In general, the worlds. The Machshava Zu Nivru V'Nisava Kol Ha'elmis Bereish Kol Dargin Ad Sof Kol Dargin. With this thought, divine thought was created and brought into being all existence, all the worlds from the highest levels to the lowest levels. Okay. But, like we said before, but their creation there is not a Metzias Davar, it's part of, basically because it's all still in a concentrated point, all within that original first creation. Ukamaymer, like we say, the statement, v'kulam niskarim b'skira achas. It's all gazed upon with one look. It's like a snapshot. It's like a snapshot. And I don't mean a snapshot like a picture. I mean that it's in the all existence is now concentrated in one place. So you look at it one gaze, like a bird's eye view. So you don't yet have the structured, defined existence, but you have it all. Now, all in that gaze. Now, of course, this has to be distinguished when we spoke about Lifnei Tzimtzum, which we'll talk about in a moment. When we said God envisions existence, that envisioning is before the Tzimtzum. That's completely godly energy. After the Tzimtzum, Ak, it has a similarity that it is God's envisioning, but it's envisioning already in the constant context of an existence. It's not a Metzias Davar as in substance, but there is an existence already. That's the difference between before the Tzimtzum and after the Tzimtzum. Like when the artist is envisioning the art in his deepest parts of his soul, that would be like before the Tzimtzum. When he's visioning the art and he's already standing by it with a canvas and now has a whole picture of existence, but he's in a state where he's making, let's say, the general outline on the canvas. Or in this case, everything is concentrated. He starts with one point. That would be Ak, just to explain the difference between, which is a fundamental difference. Because before the Tzimtzum, it's all about the divine. And after the Tzimtzum Ak, though it's true that there is it's still in an amorphous and nebulous state, but we call it a level. It's machshava. Something happened. Bereshis bara lekim. There was a creation. However, the creation, like he says, not a Metzias Davar. And then afterwards, so everything is there like in one concentrated gaze. And then afterwards, next step is that it becomes detailed. Nifratu becomes distinct, and it breaks down into details. Yitziv is galus chutz l'machshavazu, like dibur goes outside of the thought. Now, in the lower levels, it becomes yitziyah. In other words, it emerges from and goes out, exits from the way it's all concentrated in ak. These metzias called elam, that each world should become an existing entity. The way it arose, accordingly, obviously to the Ratzon, which is there in Ak. So the details are not new entities that are not going, God forbid, according to the Ratzon. It's God Ratzon, that's the Ratzon. So you have essentially two stages of creation. The creation in a klal, in a general concentrated point, like I said, one cell, but a child was conceived. And then as it breaks into details in the lower levels of all the elements, Atzilus, Bri, Yitzir, Asi, and so on. Okay. Now again, always repeat a certain point. All this is not because God needs to do it this way. This makes it sensible, logical to us. We understand the process, that there's a process. It makes sense to us, just like it makes sense. If you suddenly went outside one morning, you saw a tree, came out of nowhere, it would be like a miracle. It doesn't make sense in our system of logic. When you see a seed, and then the seed slowly grows and develops and breaks into details and branches off, and then slowly you see the tree grow over a number of years, that is the way we understand a process. And since the Eibishter created in a way the world that with this type of logic, so he himself creates in this form. Machshava dibur. The only difference is his machshava creates. Our machshava is just a thought. And so it originates, the idea originates in the words of the thought, and then it breaks into speech. But by the godly, divine energy, thought is a creator. It actually creates, that's his power. So in a way you could say machshava agduma da'ak, or in this case, rotzen or machshava, is another interface. Because on one hand, it's similar to our understanding of what thought is. On the other hand, it's very divine, it creates. So at least you have something to hold on to. Because in other words, you could have said God just created something. Why do you have to use the word machshava? That it arose in his thought, it arose in his will. Because then we have something to hold on to and say, now I understand. Just like I have a will, a desire, rotzen, and I have a machshava, so does God, but the difference is he's God and I'm not. So therefore God's thought creates, but you have something at least you could talk about. So you could imagine, if your thought created, if we had the power that when you thought something, that itself created something, that would be an example. So at least you could imagine it, but it doesn't mean we can do that. So machshava has that power, but on the other hand, it's still in a machshava state, meaning it's still in that state that is not mitzias dova, what he calls a substance. Just like the words that you utter, that you're hearing from my mouth, if I didn't speak, the words could be in my mind, in my thoughts, but they don't have tangible, concrete expression. Okay. That's what we learned until yesterday as well. Now we'll continue from where we stopped. Ubechlolos. So first he said that bechlolos ha'elemis, this is ak, the rotzen. Now he's going to say ubechlolos, and in general he doesn't say elemis anymore now, because we're not talking about ishtalshlus. Ubechlolos, in the overall picture of everything, even higher than ishtalshlus, even pre-Tzimtzum. Well, no, I should correct myself. He's going to speak la'achar and pre-Tzimtzum. He's going ubechlolos in general, even more general than ak. What level is this? Hu b'chinas Malchus the Ein-Sof. K'moishehu la'achar at-Tzimtzum. Because where does machshav of ak get this thought from? It doesn't come from nowhere. It also comes from higher levels. Just like our thoughts. Thought is not the beginning of the process. Thought is the beginning of a gili, of an idea, that thought, you're thinking about something. But there's seichel that precedes machshava. So the same thing here, machshav of ak, he's saying originates from Malchus of Ein-Sof as it stands after the Tzimtzum. I know this may throw some people because till now we've been learning about Malchus the Ein-Sof before the Tzimtzum. It's the lowest level where the kav originates from, the lowest level of the 10 hidden spheres. But remember, just like Malchus of Atzilus becomes Keser of Biyah, remember Malchus plays a dual role. So Malchus of Ein-Sof, we're going to learn now, has how it's before the Tzimtzum. That's still the 10 hidden spheres, how God is envisioning existence, but it's not, there's no existence yet. Not like Ak. Then that Malchus the Ein-Sof, the Tzimtzum conceals it all, but the Malchus the Ein-Sof returns, so to speak, with a Kav, and that's Malchus the Ein-Sof as it stands after the Tzimtzum. Because the Kav is originating from there. So there's Malchus the Ein-Sof as it's after the Tzimtzum. That's what he's saying now, which is sometimes called the Keser Kloli. It's called, we've learned, if you remember, there's a level of Atik, Ke'ein Atik, the Mailam Gulgalta, there's a Ke'ein Atik higher than Ak. So Ak also has Chochma Bina Das and has Keser of Ak. Keser of Ak is essentially Malchus of Ein-Sof that originates before the Tzimtzum and now has come after the Tzimtzum. Just to place it properly. So he says, Ubechlolos, this machshava that we're talking about, even more generally speaking, is the level of Malchus of Ein-Sof as it now stands after the Tzimtzum. Shezeu b'chinas hamachshava. Listen to this. Haseveves umakefes kol ha'ishtalshus meresh kol dargan ad sev kol dargan. This is the level of thought that surrounds and encompasses. Because surrounds, we know, the Alter Rebbe says surround doesn't mean outside, surrounding from outside. It means it's not an immanent and internal energy. It encompasses the whole ishtalshlus, which is, of course, begins with ak. This is something that encompasses it all, from the highest levels to the lowest levels. I'm going to explain in a moment. Hu nikra Tehiru Tato'oh. So it has actual name. It's called Tehiru Tato'oh. So you may recall we learned about Tehiru law, Tehiru Tato'oh. Tehiru means basically day, light. When you say Tehiru, bright light. Tehiru also comes from the word pure. So when you talk about Tehiru, there's a Tehiru Tato'oh, which in Chassidus, there's different places where this is placed. Tehiru Tato'oh is Malchus of Ein-Sof after the Tzimtzum, and Tehiru law is Malchus of Ein-Sof, and maybe all this 10 spheres before the Tzimtzum. So when you have the expression in the beginning of Zohar, Bereish from Menusa de Malka, Goliv Galifu b'Tehiru law. Remember that? Bereish from Menusa de Malka, in the beginning when God gave permission, or God desired, the king desired existence. What happened? Goliv Galifu, he engraved something in this level called Tehiru law, which is the 10 hidden spheres in God's envisioning existence. So that's Tehiru law. Tehiru Tato'oh is how that vision translates into existence after the Tzimtzum. So let me explain, because here we have now a bunch of levels. And how do you distinguish between Tehiru law, the 10 hidden spheres before the Tzimtzum, this now Tehiru Tato'oh, Malchus of Ein-Sof after the Tzimtzum, that's Sevav, that surround, that encompasses everything, and Ak. Didn't we just say Ak also encompasses everything? It's the Skira Achas. It gazes upon everything. So I want to just say a few words about distinguishing, because it all sounds like similar levels, but they're not. So we need an example, obviously. And let's just go back to the same example I've been using all the time, the artist. So when you really dissect things, it breaks down into more detail, more levels than we can imagine. So in general, we spoke about in the artist, I'm going to go from the top. Someone who is not even defined as an artist yet. He has many more things inside of him than being an artist. I'm talking about even on a human level. You know, you could be a teacher, you could be a rabbi, you can be a father, you can be a businessman, whatever. But he also has the artist within him. Then that artist within him emerges as an artist. But an artist is a very general statement. So artist now comes the next step, that this artist wants to create art. But he's capable of creating infinite possibilities. Obviously, humans can't do infinite, but figuratively speaking, what kind of art are you going to create? An artist can create so much different types of art. So then comes the next level. He chooses the type of art he's going to create. We call that the 10 hidden spheres. What does that mean? That within him, he's determined, I'm going to create a landscape, or I'm going to paint a portrait of a person, or I'm going to paint an image of the heavens. I mean, I'm just giving you examples. But it's now become there's no art yet, there's no creation yet, it's all within the artist. He's envisioning one of infinite possibilities. That's shir atzmei b'koyach, that from the infinite, one of the options of the infinite. So it's still really a piece of infinity. However, it's now becoming something that has some distinct direction. In this case, 10 hidden spheres, but it's all within the artist's mind and his dreams and his imagination, however you want to call it. It's nothing close to creation, because he could have that thought. I'm using the word thought, but it could be other words as well. He could have that energy, and you know what? He can never end up creating art altogether. He can go on the rest of his life and never do it. He had a nice idea and didn't do it. That's possible too. But then he makes a decision he's going to do it. So we've learned all the different levels. I'm not discussing now the levels before the Tzimtzum. Let's now talk. So now comes the day. The day, I'm using the mashal, so it's in time. Obviously in the nimshal, in the moral, it's all above time. So now comes the moment he's going to create art. He's already prepared everything in his mind. He has he has envisioned everything he wants to do, but it's all still part of the artist. In that sense, there's nothing of substance to talk about. The truth is, in the context here, you can't even call it a machshava in the sense of an actual creation that God's thought creates. But then comes the creation part. This machshava, this envisioning of the artist now is turning into a creation. In God's context, he doesn't have to take a paintbrush technically, because his machshava, like we just said, creates. But we don't yet have creation. So this would be called, like, even before machshava gduma, this is called all within the divine infinite consciousness before the tzimtzum, God is envisioning. So we don't use the word machshava, except in relative terms. Remember, we learned Ratzon Klali, Heskim, Shakvetaria, Hachlota, Ratzon Klali, Ratzon Klali, Ratzon Prati, and Ratzon HaKodum. Those words are used, but they're all, as we've discussed, all relative to the way things are before the tzimtzum. Nothing in that reality nothing there's no creation yet. Then comes the tzimtzum. God introduces, the artist introduces a new force, a force that was not here till now, an actual concealment of all the infinite possibilities, an actual concealment of the intensity. We learned much earlier all the effects of the tzimtzum, of the intensity of the 10 hidden spheres were completely submerged in those infinite possibilities. So you need to some way silence them. So that's what's called the tzimtzum, like we said, that it retreats, the energy that is everywhere, in a sense, what was the word I used? Not reverts. Retreats is a good word. It's also a better word would be, it retracts, contracts. What do I use? Like when the water goes back into the ocean after it comes down. Recedes, yeah. So it recedes, only the gili of it. Obviously, it still remains there concealed, and there are levels that the tzimtzum doesn't even affect because they're beyond it all, just for the whole full picture. So now what happens next is, now there's the cholol u'makom panei. So now you have space. What has the artist done? He's created space where he's going to now actually produce and create the art. So now, based on, obviously, the Esespheres Agnuzas that he envisioned before the tzimtzum. So now comes a kav, a flow of energy that is preceded by the tzimtzum. So there's a certain leap, like we learned, it touches negei v'davuk to the eagle, which is the Malchus of Ein-Sof before the tzimtzum. But at the same time, it follows the tzimtzum. So, like he said, dvekus, but not dvekus mamish. Because now there's been a leap. So now the artist has had the tzimtzum, so he can now create a specific form of art, the art that he wants to create. Now, when you put a microscope on this level after the tzimtzum, you're also going to find levels. So let's go from the top down. When he's creating the art, to make sure that it's exactly the way he wants it to be, even as he's about to start creating the art, there's a certain, we'll call a hovering element that he calls seveves u'makefes, Malchus of Ein-Sof after the tzimtzum. It's like basically like think of it as like someone overseeing the building of a structure. You know, once you've determined you're going to build a house, so now the building begins, but you need someone to maintain the integrity of it. So there's a level that's called seveves u'makefes to the whole picture. In the artist, he has in mind, he has everything he wants to create. Even while he's beginning to, even as he begins to specifically create a specific level. Just 1 second, please. Give me a second. Okay. So what you have is the Malchus of Ein-Sof that comes after the Tzimtzum retains the vision, the pure vision as it was before the Tzimtzum. But it's not specifically involved. Think of it, like I said, an overseer who's making sure that all the work being done to create, to build the house, or in this case, to create the art, is being done properly. So essentially, it's like when a writer is writing words, even though he's writing details, he always has in the back of his mind, what does he want to say? Where's he going with this? So that's how I would explain Malchus of Ein-Sof. It essentially is like maintaining the big picture, but it's not in any specific way. It's like from outside, but it's overseeing the whole structure. Then comes, that becomes Kesed of Ak, and Ak is the next step. What is Ak? Ak is the actual full picture. Like if the artist would make a outline, before he draws all the details, he makes an outline. And he actually puts onto the canvas all the main points, let's say. But they're all still in a concentrated way. There's no detail, you can't see the details, but it's an actual form and structure. So it's not just overseeing it. That would be kulam niskarim b'skira achas, that it's all like in one gaze, but it's one machshav. Now the creation has happened. Malchus of Ein-Sof is part of this machshav. That's why it says b'chlolus hu b'chinas Malchus the Ein-Sof. That's the machshav that's meseveves. So basically the thought has two, I would say like two steps. One thought that makes sure that whatever is being expressed is consistent with the big picture. And the second level of thought is the actual thought that has in it like a kernel, the seed of everything that will come from it. And then of course comes the dibur when it actually breaks into details. That's how, even though he doesn't explain it, but by saying that Malchus of Ein-Sof after the Tzimtzum, he says, that's the machshava, that's seveves v'keleles. He doesn't use on the word ak, seveves, umakefes. By ak, he says, niskarim b'skira achas. So essentially, ak is more like a pnimi, and the Malchus of Ein-Sof is more like a makif. That would be another way of putting it. But they're both part of the machshava that creates. So therefore, this is Tehiru Tato'oh. It's a form of a makif. Okay.
Both together?
Any questions?
Yeah, both together to Tehiru Tato'oh, or just the Malchus, it's makif?
Looks like only Malchus of Ein-Sof is Tehiru Tato'oh.
Okay.
The makif. So in other words, if Ak would look like this, there's a makif around Ak. Remember, there's a makif around that makif. The Igul HaGadol is Tehiru Law. That's like Pre-Tzimtzum that encompasses all of it. So basically, you have everything here in a very progressive and structured way, because everything is originating before the Tzimtzum, but it's also relating now to existence. So you constantly see here how the interface, the dance, the constant balance between, is it reflecting the divine? Is it becoming the structure that the divine wants? So he's now added a few levels here. Okay.
It sounds like the Tzimtzum affected Malchus of Ein-Sof, and that's when it becomes Tira Ilah.
Tato'oh.
No, Ilah. I'm asking about Tira Ilah.
Tira Ilah is pre-Tzimtzum here.
Both all entirely pre-Tzimtzum. The makif created by the Tzimtzum is then after Tzimtzum Tehiru Tato'oh.
This explanation after the Tzimtzum is Tehiru Tato'oh, and the pre-Tzimtzum, whether it's the 10 hidden spheres or Malchus of Ein-Sof, the Igul HaGadol is Tehiru Ilah.
Igul Gadol including. The Igul Gadol is a result of the Tzimtzum.
No, but it's a result as an Igul, but the level is not a result of the Tzimtzum. The level is Ein-Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum.
Yeah.
It only serves like an Igul because of the Tzimtzum. But the is the same as before the Tzimtzum. The Igul HaGadol is not a creation. Is the before the Tzimtzum, but it's in a state of recession. It's receded.
Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you.
So the Tzimtzum impacted it that it shouldn't shine in a revealed way in the Chol L'Mokum Ponei. There are levels like Tiferes HaNelam that the Tzimtzum doesn't affect altogether. But so that it affected in that way that it shouldn't shine, but the Ur itself remains intact. It's like the brilliance of the teacher or the brilliance of the artist that's behind the scenes. It still remains there. It's just not shining in the actual reality of existence because it would overwhelm everything. Okay. So now we've established that the machshava that creates, first he said it was bria, general elemus it's ak, and now generally it's Malchus of Ein-Sof that in a sense encompasses everything.
So
now, remember, Malchus of Ein-Sof is essentially what becomes Keser and essentially creates ak. So that's okay. We're not talking about the Kav right now, even though the Kav plays prominent role, because this is the one that carries this energy. But we're going to get back to the Kav later. So let's just continue here. Ach Kamoy came.
in the mashal with the artist, so you have when the artist is painting a particular spot in the painting, he has to have a whole painting in mind. Because, if he does a random dots, it's not going to come anywhere. So is that like what you're saying is the inyan of the makif? Just knowing the whole picture when you're putting each dot in?
Something like that, yeah. Yeah. And I added another level, not just there's something in between the dots. There's a level when he makes the first general, he puts onto the canvas the general, like a nakuda, a concentrated point from which the dots will then emerge. So there's also a level of actual creation of the art itself. But what we're talking about is what you just said, the vision that he has that is so-called encompassing all the details. And the details are therefore informed by that, yeah.
Where are you holding, Rabbi?
Excuse me?
Where are you holding?
The line begins, Hishtalshus Meresh Kol Dargin, page 1172, like 2/3 of the way down. Okay, we continue. Ach Kamoy Kain, Hu B'chinas Malchus the Ein-Sof Kedem Tzimtzum. So now the Rebbe Rashab is broadening the picture. He's going to reintroducing before Pre-Tzimtzum. Says, Ach Kamoy Kain, what we just said about machshava, creating, that in general, that is the level of Ak. And more generally, the level of Malchus of Ein-Sof. He says, however, same thing is in Malchus of Ein-Sof Pre-Tzimtzum. Shehi machshava da'ano emlech. Because like we learned earlier, that is the machshava, we're still in the divine consciousness. There's no tzimtzum yet. But as the machshava, God's thought of ano emlech, I will rule. That's why it's called Malchus of Ein-Sof. It's true, it's all within the divine consciousness, but something's there. So he's saying what we're talking about here is really broadening the picture, is also on the level of Malchus of Ein-Sof, Lifnei Tzimtzum. That's why I gave the arichas. In other words, we're talking here before the artist has begun to create the art, and not even the general Tehiru Tato'oh that informs all the ak and all the details, the general picture and all the details, that makif of Tehiru Tato'oh, going back, if you work your way back, it all originates in the artist before he's even creating art. How he's envisioning the whole thing in the first place, on his terms, not relating to actual creation. So the truth is, machshava goes all the way back to that. The machshava v'ano emlech. He uses the word machshava. Shezeu ikar sibas ha'isavus. Shezeu ikar sibas ha'isavus ha'elamus. That is the real primary cause. Remember, there'd be no Tehiru Tato'oh, and there'd be no ak, there'd be no kav, there'd be nothing if it didn't originate in the divine consciousness in the highest levels before the Tzimtzum. So that's the primary sibba. Why does he say ikar? Why don't you just say that's the sibba? Because he's acknowledging that, of course, when you break it down, every level is the cause. But the primary cause is the original thought pre-Tzimtzum of Ano Emlech. We discussed Ano Emlech Ein Melech B'layam. Ano Emlech is not that God wants to rule. It means that God wants another that recognizes his authority. Okay. So Ikasibis is Savas Elmas, the Ein Melech B'layam. Like he says here clearly, there's no king without a nation. Sheyeh b'chinas nefrodim dafka. So no emlech means that the desire to have an am, which is specifically nefrodim, separate from him. You cannot be a king over your own children, over yourself. So the whole no emlech that originates, it's in different words. It means to be a dira b'tachtenim, that there should be something that's nefrodim. That's only possible after the Tzimtzum, but this already originated before the Tzimtzum. So in other words, it's not some incidental thing. The whole reason there was a Tzimtzum in the first place, the whole reason you're creating art is not to create art. He's creating art because he wants a world that's nifrodim, separate from him and their consciousness, and that they should connect with him. So therefore, when you really trace machshava, the thought process of God's thought process, you get back to pre-Tzimtzum. We're still middle of the subject, so we'll see. We're not sure where he's going yet with this. But obviously he's going to bring it back to our whole discussion of the process of creation. And when it arose in his thought, in God's blessed thought, Yisbarach, machshavta Yisbarach, the thought of the Yisbarach. Ano emlech, that when it arose that I shall rule, nesavu kol ha'elamis, b'koyach the shir ba'atzmei b'koyach kol ma she'osel is b'peil acharat tzimtzum. Oh, okay. So that brought into being all the worlds with the power of what he allocated or what he envisioned. He translates shir atzmei b'koyach, that he envisioned within himself potential, in the potential state, everything that will ultimately be the future that will ultimately emerge after the Tzimtzum. Now we have to understand what this means exactly. What does this mean? Does this mean that this created the Tzimtzum and all the worlds afterwards, or something was created by the very thought, the divine thought where he's envisioning existence? Something itself is created from that, which would of course pose a big problem. What do you mean? What does that mean? There are no two creations here. So let me read on till, and then I'll explain it. My hunches, my guesses, that he means that the whole, everything that would follow was created by this machshava. Remember, we said God's machshava creates. So the truth is, it all originates. Where's the first thought? The first thought is before the Tzimtzum. So that's what does the creation. That's what causes the Tzimtzum to happen, the Kav, Tehiru, Tato'oh, Ak, and the rest. That's what it sounds like he's saying. That when he imagined it already, or he envisioned it already, that itself turned into a process. It wasn't just within his own being. However, when you break it into levels, shir atzmei b'koyach is pre-Tzimtzum. It's all within the divine. In other words, that level alone would not be enough. There has to be a Tzimtzum, and there has to be a creation. But it all begins with that process of the machshava ano emlech lifnei hatzimtzum, which is nesava kol b'keir the shir atzmei kol ma she'osel is b'peil acharat tzimtzum. So that means that it's not, however, there it's not even a concentrated point, which is like Ak. It's not Tehiru Tato'oh, which oversees and makes sure that it's all being done according to the Kavanah. Here it's all within the divine consciousness itself. His envisioning it is the driving force that causes everything else to happen from there. That's what it sounds like. Okay. Ubchinas melucha zu hu hanikra covered. Remember back on the bottom of page 1170, when he started Baruch Kvoid Hashem Imkemei, he said, what's covered? Malchus. Kvoid Malchus Yemeru. Yeah. A Malchus is covered. So he's giving this another name now. This level of Meluch is called covered. So now we have a covered that's before the Tzimtzum. Ukamoishin is barely ill. And now he's bringing back another mimer from volume 1. You may remember this. This was right at the end of the first section when he finished explaining the 3 levels of spheres, the 3 meanings from the number mispar, from number, narrative, sipur, and sapir, transparence. So then he went on to say that the same thing in Keser, you also have 2 levels. Well, actually 3 levels. But he spoke about 2 levels in general, which he's now quoting the Dibra Masav Lo Yochel Yesef Lisapik. So he says on the bottom, that's volume 1, page 236. There, that was the end of the first section in Ayin Beis in volume 1, where he concluded with the 3 meanings in Keser. So what does he say there? And what's he connecting it here? So he said there like this. We discussed there, Be'inyan Hod Melech Hadras Melech. He spoke about 2 levels of 2. There's called Hod Melech and Hadras Melech. What's the difference between the 2? They seem to mean the same thing. Hod means the beauty, and Hadras means beauty. You know, you say Hod, the beauty of the king, Hod Malchus, and Hadras Melech. When you say someone, Rev Am Hadras Melech, when there's a lot of people that adds to the glory or the honor or the cover of the king. So we learn there, he says, that the difference in Hod Melech and Hadras Melech is this. The Hod Melech, hu k'mosha melech hu beheichale. Hod Melech refers to the Melech as he is in his inner sanctum, in his chamber. Beheichale pnima, I should add. In his inner sanctum, in his inner chamber. Al kisim al chusei, where he sits on his throne, on the kingly throne. In a certain fundamental, core, essential reimamus, removed from everything, not reimus on the am, not that he's Shmoi Ma'ala, but as he is in his own inner world, in his inner sanctum, his reimus atzmi. He fundamentally is in a different level as he is on his own. So think of the Rebbe being completely on his own, not in relation to his people. That's Hod Melech. For Hadras Melech is a lower level. Alam, the Berev Am, Dafke Hadras Melech. That's already his glory, his Reimamus, his exalted state, but in relation to the people. Like he says, Berev Am, that when you have a lot of people, Dafke, that Hadras Melech, that is an honor to the king. If you make a big parade honoring the king and only 3 people show up, well, it's in a sense a lack of respect and covet for the king. Hadras Rev Am, everybody shows up. It's a large audience, a large crowd that shows uncovered, which of course has the gain halacha. For example, the shaila about a bris. You know, on one hand, you have do you do a bris when there's more people can come to the bris, or do you do it earlier because ziz and magdim and mitzvahs? So there's a real shaila and halacha here. Ziz and magdim and mitzvahs means as soon as the 8th day comes, you do the bris as soon as possible. Some people can't show up 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock in the morning, but that's one opinion. Another, Berev Am Hadras Melech, a mitzvah should be done with as many people as possible. It shows uncovered. So then you could do what you should wait. When it comes to a bris, actually, ziz and magdim, I don't want to say the word trumps, but it trumps Berev Am Hadras Melech. But there are other dinim where Berev Am Hadras Melech is more important than ziz and magdim, just to give it a little context. But the point is that Berev Am Hadras Melech is the Melech as he relates to Revam. Why does the Melech need the nation? Why does he need anybody? If the Melech is really removed and truly confident and secure, and he's be'etzem beyond everything, what difference does it make if one person shows up or no one shows up? Because there's two levels. There's the Melech as he is in his inner sanctum taka, that's beyond anybody. There he doesn't need anyone. He's beyond them all. It's his fundamental state of a loftier or exalted state, not as in relation to others. And then the Melech as he relates to others, so then Berevam is significant. Just to give it a little more explanation, because you think it seems like a very superficial thing. Who really cares how many numbers show up? I mean, it's not like some type of PR event that the inauguration has to have more people. So just to give an example, the Rambam says there's a mitzvah it's called Shmiras Migdash. It's a mitzvah to have guards who protect the Migdash. Now, why do you need guards? You'd think because you want to protect it from theft or from damage or from war or whatever it may be. So no, it says the Migdash doesn't need Shmira. Shmira is a sign of covet. When something is valuable, you put someone there, it's a sign of respect. So it's not about the technical part of people being Asham. It's a sign of respect that something has value when you watch over it. Or in the case where you have Shemrim. So similarly here, Reiv Am is not a superficial thing. It's a sign of value that the king deserves and commands that type of respect that people show up. Okay. So basically 2 levels of Reimamus HaMelech, which the Rebbe Rashab is now bringing back to our discussion here. U'kamoy kein hu inyan kfeid HaMelech hu dafke bisavus riboye elmes v'nevroim. So it looks like to me, well, yeah, so basically the same thing is in the creation of existence. We said, remember, Ana Emlech is the level of covet. Now, in this covet itself, there's 2 aspects. A covet that you have because, like he says, like a melech b'layam. So where does the covet emerge in a revealed way? Is dafke the creation of many worlds, ribui, reiv am, v'nivraim, many worlds and creations. In the root, it's that thought that we're talking that I want to rule. So it's the covet of the king. Now, we didn't establish which level of covet is it. So that's what we're going to continue in the next chapter, in the next paragraph. That apparently, and this is I'm speculating, that the covet of the Melech, Hod Melech, would be Emlech of Malchus Ein-Sof before the Tzimtzum. There's no other there. And covet Melech and Tato'oh, Malchus Ein-Sof after the Tzimtzum, that would be Hadras Melech. That's what it sounds like. He didn't say it explicitly yet, but he's going to speak about this in the next paragraph. So what we have here is that the level of covet, and like we learned back in the Maimer by Yigash, that there's 2 levels. I'm just going over in my mind this. Hod Melech, Hadras Melech. Melech as he is within his Heichel Primi, that would be like Lifnei Tzimtzum, right? So it's completely about himself, his fundamental covet. Hod Melech, I should call it, and Hadras Melech, even though it does appear from the last lines that he's referring to the second level, because Reiv Am Hadras Melech means there's a Reiv Am, there's a Ribui Yistavus, there's a creation. But we're going to continue on. But before I continue, anybody want to ask anything? Okay, so then I'll continue and see where he's going with this.
Can't Reiv Am be before the Tzimtzum? If it because he envisioned everything, it shouldn't be any stira.
You're asking? I'm not sure. What are you saying?
I'm asking if Reiv Am could be before the Tzimtzum, because everything was envisioned at that point, and you can. I don't see why there would even be a stira about that. Is that my right.
What stira are you referring to? What contradiction are you referring to?
Before the Tzimtzum, because there was no that you just mentioned.
Well, first of all, his envisioning doesn't make an That means it's all part of his envisioning. It's not actually, because then why does a king need a whole crowd? He could envision the crowd, sit in his inner sanctum and envision the crowd, and that would be enough. Remember, there's a difference between envisioning the crowd and actually having a crowd. So I think that's what he's saying is the two levels here. So yes, it's not weakening his covet when he's in his inner sanctum, but he's not relating directly. Envisioning it means on his terms. As a matter of fact, I think he's even going to bring this. If you remember when we spoke about this in Kamayim Aponim Laponim, he spoke that the first time God has to envision the because they're not there to crown him. So the first time of creation, God has to envision the neshamas that will accept him as king, but it's on his terms. And then halos man minei ubei, if you may remember. I think it's connected to that, but that still is not. If that's the case, then why can't you say, what do we need a dira b'tachtenim for? God could envision tachtenim. He can envision them struggling in Golas to make struggling, especially in Golas, to make a dira b'tachtenim, and everything is fine. He's all envisioning it all. The problem is,
ultimately, we don't know about any of this stuff. Ultimately, we don't know why any of the deep central whys, if anything.
No, my point is, why is that not enough? That he envisions the whole thing from beginning to end, from the beginning of creation till Mashiach, and that's that. Because he wants the actual atachtenim. He wants us to actually be here, be independent consciousness that we have, and we should build this dira b'tachtenim. He doesn't want it on the vision level. But the vision level does encompass the vision of what he wants, correct. But then it comes that our actual work and our actual avodah and bechira and so on. Anyway, we're still in the middle. I'm just, when I read it, I right away thought that these seem to be the two levels, but he didn't say it yet.
Can we say that
Melech is not covered?
What?
Hod Melech is not covered. Hadras Melech is covered, right?
I'm not sure. It's a good question. I'm not sure, because you can call Hod Melech maybe covered Atzmi. He didn't say. You know what? We're still in the middle. I really would like to read on. Let's see what he says and what he doesn't say. We'll guess. We'll figure it out. He said that Hod Melech is Remus Atzmi. That's the word he used. She'ena Shaykh La'am. Hadras Melech Ubchinas Remus Alam. And he says that's like Kovet Melech. So it could be that maybe Kovet Melech is only the lower level. When there's Isavos, like Malchus of Ein-Sof after the Tzimtzum.
He's
Davke.
He's concluding a Kmeiten who even Kovet Melech would Davke be Savus Ribui Ho'il.
That's why, yeah. But nevertheless, he did refer to a higher level. That's the Melech Behechole Prima. I was speculating that may be the level of Malchus Ein-Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum. That's what I said. I may be wrong. I think that's shot, but we'll see. Let me read. I'll read a few more lines.
Okay.
Or maybe we should stop here. I'm just looking how far this goes. I think we should stop here because it's going to go into more depth. Okay, so we're middle of this of the Inyan. We'll see where he's ending up. Right now, Kvod Melech looks like it's Hadras Melech. That's connected to Reiv Am, the creation. And then there's a higher level of Hod Melech as the king is in his inner sanctum, completely removed from everybody. That's what he said. Which level is which? We shall figure out. We shall see. The reason I feel, this is why I felt that even the higher level is covered. Because look at the line before Commission is Bar Le'il. He says that Malchus of Ein-Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum Shir Asmei B'Keach Kol Ma Sh'Asli Is B'Peil Acher Tzimtzum U'B'chinas Melucha Zu Hu Anikra covered. So there it's mashma that the Melucha Zu is Ano Emlech before the Tzimtzum, which creates existence. But still, it seems like the creation of existence is the Kovet Melech of Hadras Melech. But We'll work it out.
Can we
That's
call
what-
that level?
We'll
Like
be patient and we'll
potentials?
figure it out.
Can we
So one
call
second.
that level? Okay.
One second. So I'm stopping here at the bottom.